Good evening, everybody. May I please ask you to stand for the academic procession?
Please be seated. So good evening, everyone. I'm Ingrid Willard. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this very special event, the inaugural lecture of Professor Mark Smith. Very warm welcome to all of those of you joining us online and those of you in person here at Belleville Park. Mark has asked me to specially welcome a few members of his family. We're delighted that his parents, Jean and Trevor, are here in person. For a moment, we were worried that their Uber wasn't going to make it in time, so we're delighted to see you here. Mark's children, Sam and Isabella, are joining us from France via the live stream. Mark's fiancée, Ginny, is joining us from the United States of America, and Mark's brother, Neil, is joining us from the UK. It is really such a huge advantage of these new hybrid events that we can involve family and friends from all over the world. Also, a very warm welcome to our members of the Rectorate, Professor Duresh Ramjagannath and Professor Stan Duplessis. Delightful to have you here, and our new Vice Dean Research, Professor Michael Graham. Thank you also for joining us. So an inaugural lecture is a real milestone in any academic's career. It's a rite of passage that dates back hundreds of years. And it's an opportunity for the professor to profess. And what we mean by that is that they must talk knowledgeably about the work that they do, but in a way that all of us can understand, even those of us not from the same discipline. And so it's quite an art form, and I know that Mark will do an incredible job of that this evening. He really does have this incredible ability to talk about his work in a highly accessible way, but nonetheless demonstrating his great knowledge. So most of you will know that Mark was appointed 2 years ago, but due to a few small details, speed bumps in the road, thanks to the COVID pandemic, and perhaps the ineptitude of home affairs, which I think we're all trying to forget, it's taken a little while for us to get to this point. But I hope that the anticipation makes this evening even more special. So it's my role to very briefly introduce Mark to you. He was previously Faculty Dean and Professor of Human Resource Management at Grenoble School of Management in France. At Grenoble, he was Faculty Dean, the Director of the Doctoral School, a Head of Department, and a Research Team Leader for Work-Life Careers. Prior to working in France, he worked at Manchester Business School, where his research interests focused on careers and labour market policy and outcomes for women and men, including working conditions, working time, and work-life integration. He has carried out research work for a number of supranational European and national institutions on gender equality, young people, and labour market policy. He recently finished work on a large-scale European project on the impact of the crisis on youth and the role of pay transparency in closing gender pay gaps. He has authored and co-authored over 50 books, book chapters, and journal articles. He publishes regularly in the media about his research and the management of business schools. His most recent co-authored books include Youth Employment, Business Ethics, A Critical Approach, Integrating Ethics Across the Business World, and Gender and the European Labour Market. We are absolutely delighted to have an academic of Mark Smith's stature join us at Stellenbosch University. I present to you Professor Mark Smith.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to conduct an inaugural lecture and to be here with you, to join the ranks of the professors at Stellenbosch University, but also to have a moment to reflect on the work I've done over many years, and to be able to think about what that involves, what I've done, but also to recognise the colleagues that I've worked in over that time, because as with all of the academics in this room and all the academics over the world, we rarely work on our own, and we're working with other people. And that's a common theme of the things I want to talk about in a journey that's brought me from Manchester in the United Kingdom, to Grenoble in France, to now to Stellenbosch in South Africa. As the Dean said in her introduction, one of the opportunities or one of the challenges of inaugural lecture is to profess to a wider topic. And I was thinking about what sort of central theme would bind those things together, to drawing on the research across different contexts and different subjects, different organizations, different countries. I thought that time was one of those things that I wanted to pull out. So hence the title, The Times They Are Changing, which we, to be honest, we struggled with because of the slightly strange syntax, but there you'll see why that is in a few seconds. So why talk about time? So time is at the heart of how we work, when we work, our control over and our autonomy over experience of work, a sense of quality of our working time, but also the quantity of our working time. It's also something of a contested terrain, with tension over who controls that time, who regulates that time, and who is in charge of the flexibility, who benefits from that flexibility. That underpins many of the inequalities we face on the labour market, the differences that different groups of workers have, and also, really importantly, differences between men and women's experience on the labour market. And in particular, their experience of working in their paid time and their unpaid work time. Today, as we come out of the pandemic and we face new economic challenges, we see these challenges are in relation to time, in relation to debates around flexibility, in relation to how we're using time, who's able to control and operate in terms of their time, but also in terms of who's working, women and men, young people, old people, those people without work, those people with too much work. But I must admit, as a very pragmatic academic, I also looked at my bookshelf and I thought, what have I been going on about for the last 30 years? And they're not all mine, but they are the books that were on my bookshelf. And there was this sense of time ran through that. And in a way, when we do work on careers or we research on careers, we don't know where we're going. We only know about our career in a post hoc sense by looking backwards. So we can make plans, we can have aspirations, we can have hopes, but actually we only really know what we've done looking back at the different things that we've produced, the different jobs we've had, the different activities we've undertaken. And so in looking back, I thought, well, okay, this makes sense at this moment in time. That this, if you excuse the pun, that I can bring together the different themes that I've worked on and researched with other individuals in relation to time. But it's also it's a useful narrative in that sense, because as I said, around how we work, why we work, and in particular the themes around inequalities between women and men, which is one of my key themes, but also well-being and that idea of work-life balance. Now, I have to say right from the outset that I don't believe in work-life balance. Researchers don't believe in work-life balance as a rule. We tend to talk about work-life integration as we're always constantly balancing integration of unpaid and paid work, and there are spillovers that sometimes are positive and sometimes are negative, and they're not always the same for all of us. I would also abuse my power looking at my bookshelf and found also, as well as the Time books, there are a lot of books about Bob Dylan. And I abused my position to use that title of the song, but also to add my own personal story in that. Some the Bob Dylan's music's followed me throughout my life, and something that's important to me. So the title, "The Times They Are Changing." This was a song written in 1963, sung for the first time just before Kennedy was assassinated. Really a song of the moment. It was on the album of the same name in 1964. And really something that became an anthem for the civil rights movement, for campaigners at the time. Now with all Bob Dylan songs, people interpret them, over-interpret them. There's Dylanologists that say this, there's others that say that. And there are people who say, well, actually, it was of the time. But there are other people who say, actually, it's something that's timeless. And Dylan, being Dylan, doesn't say very much about it. He leaves you to decide yourself. And for many people, we can say, actually, and of the 500, we can say that it's something that continues, that remains timeless. And for the 500 plus covers that exist in the world, it's obviously timeless for many other artists in the world as well. But also I think I can put our own interpretation on it. We can take it in a literal sense that times are changing, working times are changing, the patterns of work, the patterns of flexibility. Dylan talks about protecting our time, the sense that time's important and that we have to stand up and protect our time. But also that notion that it was from one moment in time is just that the song was written also relates to the one moment in time that we are at any moment in time. Right now, post-pandemic. Other work I've done just during the financial crisis, the dot-com bubble, whenever you were, those moments in time were important, shaped the outcomes of your particular experience. So on the left, Bob Dylan's scribblings of the lyrics of the song. On the right, my scribblings around what I thought I was going to talk about today. I don't claim to be anything as timeless as this great song, but I was inspired and always am by Dylan. So I'm no great philosopher around time. I'm not going to talk about theories of time or anything like that. But when we do think about time, it's something that is we all have a perspective on, and we all have notions about that. We talk about how we use time. We talk about the passing of time. We talk about how we experience time. We talk about spending time in a quality way, having quality time with friends, family, loved ones, having a productive time. Equally, having wasting time or whiling time away on your Instagram account or whatever it might be. We have different notions of the quality of time. We talk about spending and wasting time, but actually time's the ultimate perishable. We can't put it in our back pocket and take it away and save it for a more productive time later in the day. It's gone. Like that. And that is why time is so important for the way we work as well. Because our time in the office, in our employment, in paid care and unpaid care can't be reutilized for some other moment. Which is why it's so important when we think about labour market inequalities, when we think about the way people work. So I want to talk about time and how we spend time, in that sense of how we spend time in work in different contexts. How we spend time in different contexts in terms of household and unpaid work, but also those moments in time that are particularly important. So the first thing, context. I started work in the European Work and Employment Research Centre in Manchester, working for Jill Rubery. And that was socialised me, put me into comparative work straight away. I learned very quickly, when we look at comparative work, when we compare what's going on in one country and another country, we can clearly see and challenge the norms, the expectations, the things that we think are just taken for granted around what goes on in one country and another. Different approaches to how we use time, different approaches to how women might be working or not working, who's looking after children, who's working part-time, who's working full-time, who's working unsocial hours in the evenings and weekends. All those things that there's no divine way those things should be organised. They're actually the structure and function of the societal context that we find ourselves in. And that's particularly important when we think about differences between women and men, but also differences between different classes, different occupations. The way that time is regulated can lead to unequal balances or more equal balances of paid and unpaid time, which then have impacts on who can work, how long we can work, who can have a career and who can have a more like a job. Those things are all shaped in that perspective, according to labour market power, according to history, according to regulations. This is perhaps clearly seen in the way managers organise time differently. Managers have choices. They have choices around how they organise the responses to different fluctuations in time. Choices around who works at particular times, who they source their labour supply from, whether you recruit students, whether you recruit women part-timers, whether you recruit male full-timers. All those decisions are left to managers in different contexts. And perhaps one of the areas where that's most clear is when we think about part-time work. So early work that I did with Jill Rubery and Colette Fagan looked very much at how we organise part-time work in different countries. Why we have high levels of part-time work in some countries and low levels in other countries. And there's no obvious way to organise this, and it's shaped by these different societal, sectoral, household factors that decide who's available to work, how part-time work is regulated, and how managers and organisations decide to structure the jobs that they put on offer. So part-time work can be a cheap source of flexible work that's marginalised, no career and low paid, or it can be secure and with careers like full-time work, albeit with shorter hours. So we identified how the combination of these different elements in different societies can shape low-quality part-time work in countries like Germany and the United Kingdom, but then equally in a country like the Netherlands, they can combine to be very high-quality part-time work, where part-timers are members of unions. Unions protect part-timers, importantly, as well as the regulations, as well as the managers. And you have managers even who are part-time themselves. So there's different ways of organising that are a function of these societal differences. Equally, you have other countries where people reject part-time work. A country like Finland has very high levels of women's employment, but very low levels of part-time work. Its neighbour, Sweden, has similar levels of employment, but high levels of part-time work. So there's no necessary automatic way that women should be working in part-time in that sense. So all of these societal factors are reflected in the choices that people make. But that dovetails with work that Colette Fagan's done and work subsequently followed with her, where we looked at, well, people talk about their choices. People choose to work part-time. People choose to work those hours. Men choose to work very long hours in the United Kingdom, for example, or in the United States. But those choices are actually constrained choices. So this idea of choice and constraint is very important. We're constrained by the environment we find ourselves in. We choose to work long hours because I need to work overtime to pay for whatever it might be. We choose to work part-time because school hours are of certain arrangement, because they're the jobs that are on offer. So this notion of choice and constraint is very important. We're subject to these pressures, just like organisations are subject to these pressures in terms of the constraints and the choices that we make. And what work we did subsequently pointed to the fact that if you ask people to think a little bit beyond the school hours, a little bit beyond the jobs that are available, no matter what country within the European context, we found they converged around about 30 hours. So there's no notion that the 4-day week or 40 hours a week is some sort of special arrangement. It's a made-up rule. It's a made-up rule that we made through institutions, through history, through societal fluctuations and negotiations that have somehow stalled, that have led us to where we are today. So we're also constrained by this notion of what is a full-time week. We continued this kind of work looking at different ways of working and organising work in different countries through working beyond the survey data we were using, beyond the individualised data, by doing comparative case studies, by comparing cases of the similar sectors across countries. One of these I did with Marilyn Carroll and also with Jacqueline Riley, where we compared the way that nurses organise in different countries. Now, midwifery, the biology of midwifery, I'm not a scientist, is pretty similar across countries, I'm pretty sure. But the way that nurses are organised was really quite different. The UK, again, had these very long shifts of people working 4 times 12 hours and then having a long break of time, which were nice if you were young and fit and able to cope with that, and then you had a long time off. But if you were slightly older, or you had a family, or you had a life even, then that's tough, okay? Whereas in other countries, managers were saying, actually, we can organise it in different ways. We can have 5 shorter shifts. We can have rolling shifts. We can have shifts more like we might see in a shop or in a factory or wherever it might be. But even though there's a feminised labour supply in nursing, the managers in the UK were hard and fast on their long shift. Okay, so there was this sense of that even though there was similar technical demand that was the same and across across contexts, the actual way the countries and the managers in each country were organised, it was really quite different. And that fed into work we also did with Gerhard Bosch and Stefan Lendorf, where we actually used large-scale data sets to explore within different sectors the same problematic, the same question, whether that existed. And we find different types of labour supply, different average hours, different types of part-time working, different levels of shift working across those countries. Now, as many researchers, you're often inspired by what's going on in your life. I was walking my son to nursery when he was quite small, and I was thinking, well, there are these people who work in the nursery who work in those same long shifts so that I can have a nice life. So I can drop my kid off and go to work and come back when I want to. So we, with Gwen Oliver, Marilyn Carroll, Sirin Sung, we did a series of case studies across the northwest of England looking at how work is organised in creches, in childcare. Now, there's a certain irony here that there are people, mainly women, almost exclusively women, with their own work-life challenges who have poor work-life and well-being outcomes in terms of long shifts and farming out into informal care themselves, while they're providing formal care in a long service to people like me. And this highlights how there's this sort of class inequalities between different groups of people according to what they can afford. But also we found within and across sectors, within the nursery, the public and private healthcare, childcare sectors, we found that there are some providers were actually given a service to a different group of employees. People who work in schools or people who work to students in student areas, they were able to offer more short hours as an organisation, so they were more flexible themselves towards their own employees. And the managers themselves were able to retain those employees, because what we found in the other places was that those employees who were forced to work very long hours, they could tot up how much they were paid, how many hours they worked. They can look at a supermarket where they're paid the same, if not more, and the supermarket was able to offer much greater flexibility. So even though they had greater intrinsic job satisfaction, the actual manager's frame, the way the work was organised, led to them going elsewhere. Subsequent work I did with Marilyn Carroll as well in the transport sector. We found similar results for men as well. Transport sector has a big problem with talent recruitment, retention right now all over the world because of the poor working conditions. We can really see this contextual effect very clearly when we look at expatriates. And I've done a bit of work on expatriates with a number of colleagues. Because if you take an expatriate, pick him up out of France or out of the United Kingdom and plonk him down in South Africa or wherever, he brings his own norms, expectations and standards, and he finds himself with a new societal frame. And so those people actually provide quite a useful reference to say, well, what's the thing that stands out to them? What are they observing? Now, this work was not driven necessarily by work-life, but it emerged as a topic. And work I'm doing now with Catherine Jones in Manchester links to this. But work I published in the early 2000s with Laura Lett, we've identified Polish expatriates in the United Kingdom that were of a more conservative Catholic background, were deeply dismayed by the British system of the low amount of time you spent with your family, the long working hours that you had to work, the idea that Sunday was not a special day, but for them it was something that was really important for binding the family together. At the other extreme, I've done some work with Michel Milik, again with Catherine Jones and Vikram Basista in France, where we look at Indians going to France who come to, and they said, I didn't think this was going to happen, but I learned the art of work-life balance in France, because in India, that's not a thing, okay? There's very negative outcomes in terms of working time, long working hours that people work. So you can see how these expatriates are sort of picked up and put down in a different place. One of the things that we've also been working on is about the regulation of time, the regulation of the labour market that impacts upon time. And this limit on time is a real touchstone. It's like it drives the right crazy. The people are libertarians because they think that we should be allowed to work as many hours as we like, and the right in France are very much against the 35-hour week you can see on the screen, whereas the left very much see that as a lodestar for their policy making, and something that we should be protected against ourselves. protect against overwork ourselves, protected our households should be protected, and equally, we may be even to be able to share out some work. And the initial motivations of the 35-hour week was exactly that. So a number of comparative projects, we've looked at regulation of time across countries. Again with Jacqueline O'Reilly, but then also with Jill Ruby and others, we looked at how time was regulated in the UK, and there was very much this libertarian perspective, and really to reject any notion of working time limits or working time caps. Even though the regulatory system had other thresholds inside built into it, having an upper limit was really something that went against the idea of individual freedom. And so we found the UK as an outlier in the European Union in this sense. But when the UK actually adopted the European regulations, they adopted them at a very weak level. And this demonstrates another thing that we've pointed to, how different societal systems are subject to their own path trajectory, their own path-specific trajectory. They can't overnight become something else. I heard it in the UK, I hear it in South Africa. We love to become Germany. Let's have the German training system. Well, we can't, because it's built on history and all of the institutions that come from that. And that path-specific trajectory is what shapes those outcomes. And that's also why we see the UK, when it adopts those regulations, that it adopts them in its own particular British way. But the regulation of time doesn't just relate to the number of hours we work. One of the projects I worked on with a group from Spain, including the Immaculada Cebrian, Maria Ángeles Davia, we looked at the regulation of transitions. If you think about how people transition between different working times across their lives, those moments, they're moments of insecurity, moments when people can fall out of the labour market, when people might end up taking a less secure job, or in particularly at the time of childbirth, people take a less good part-time job rather than being able to change the working times they have within their existing job. We found that where there was a stronger regulation to make transitions within your job in terms of working time, people took over their life course, took more secure pathways. They were less likely to fall out. And that means they remain productive, they remain in the occupations which are suitable for their and aligned with their particular training and occupation. Underpinning much of this is this notion of unpaid work. Who does the unpaid work? Dylan talks about your time being something worth saving, and so you better get moving with it. You better start saving it. And this idea of unpaid time and the life course is really central to much of the inequalities we face between different groups of workers. But also at critical moments of the life course, individuals are at risk, but also the idea of taking a life course approach underlines that we're not all the same all of our lives. The standard employment relationship was traditionally traced around the man, who would work full-time for 40 years, and everybody else had to adapt or do something different. Whereas if we take a more flexible approach across the life course, then we say, well, people have different demands across their life course, and they can adjust their working times, or will need to adjust their working times at different times. You might have care for your older parents, even when you're an older worker. You might be doing studies at the same time as working. So for critical stages of life course, people have if there is not this protection for transitions, then people risk either falling out of the labour market, or they risk making decisions which are unhelpful for the rest of us. They might delay family formation. They might delay independent households. When we see the low birth rates in some countries, periods of insecurity at key moments of the life course are particularly important. We see that with the work I've done with Paola Villa in relation to comparing Italy and other countries within the European Union. But also this notion of unpaid and how much and the quality of unpaid is also subject to our societal context. Work I did with Pierre-Yves Sancio in France and UK shows that people have rather similar levels of satisfaction subjectively for quite different experiences. We find that people who were working very relatively long hours were in the UK were still recorded levels of satisfaction that were quite high, even though they were working much longer hours than their French counterparts. Whereas their French counterparts working short hours but intense and dense because of the 35-hour week, it's compressed into that time. So their actual well-being was also pressured as well. So people again are judging their individual satisfaction with their work and their paid and unpaid time against this context. Now this is a nice picture. The reality is normally like this, okay? It's not normally a man, it's normally a woman, and they're normally doing many things at the same time, and which underlines how difficult it is to do something else as well, to participate fully in the labour market. And as I said, this underlines the inequalities faced between women and men, but also underlines the patterns we see on the labour market, in particular in relation to dual learning. I started off my career looking at dual learners, how different countries, the societal systems shape different household outcomes. So you have households where there are 2 full-time workers because the societal forces conspire, support that type of arrangement. They might conspire to support them because you have to have 2 full-time jobs to survive, or they might conspire and support because you can do that because there's good quality childcare, or there's tax advantages for childcare, or whatever it might be. Elsewhere, we might find ourselves with 1.5 earners, where you have somebody who's working full-time and somebody who's working part-time. Or somebody we have 1 earner and somebody who falls out of the labour market, normally the woman, in that particular context. I'm currently finalising work with Marilyn Clark and Tracy Scurry about how couples negotiate. A lot of the work-life balance or work-life integration literature is focused on women. Work-life is a woman's issue. But actually, as we see generational change, and see this in work I've also done with Carrie Shude in North America around accountants, generations bring different perspectives and they demand different things. And so there's this notion of negotiation between members of a dual learning couple, and that work life is not a woman's issue, it's a parent issue, or it's a household issue for all workers. And that underlines how we as society, all societies, are not measuring that unpaid work. That social reproduction, producing more of the family of individuals in society, is fundamental. Societies break down if there's not a growth of the population or a sustainable supply of population. So that work is really, really valuable, but we don't measure that unpaid work. The work I've done with Francesca Bettio and Yannicka Plantenga highlighted the idea that we need to measure and count and support that unpaid work. But equally, if you think of it like that, then regulation, rather than being something that binds managers or organisations to do their jobs, regulation could be a productive force. Regulation of equal opportunities actually is something that helps society grow. And those countries that are suffering from population challenges, we'll see how they find their future labour supply with extremely low birth rates. This body of work sort of contributes to this idea that regulation can be a force for pushing managers, pushing countries into a sort of a win-win growth path. A sort of a productive factor for women and men, for more inclusive labour markets. Also work then with Paola Villa, we point to the fact that if you have 2 workers in the household, you share the risk. Our work on the financial crisis showed that men often were the ones that lost their jobs first in the financial crisis of 2008-9. Okay? Now, in a dual earner household, there's still an earner in the household. In a single earner, male-led household, then the loss of a male earner means the household becomes a non-working household. And that is much worse for everybody in the household. Okay? So that means that dual earning is a way to share the risk of the house for the household on the labour market. It also means that equal opportunities legislation, protection for women and men, is not just an issue for women, because if the household has a female-headed earner, then the inequalities that women face actually impact upon a whole household, not just on the woman herself. Do you know how hard it is to find a picture that demonstrates being in the wrong place at the wrong time? But Bob Dylan's song is very much about being in a moment in time, and we can see that here with our friend. Happens to be the wrong place at the wrong time. But this idea being of the moment in time shaping particular outcomes is another part of the research I've been doing. And in particular, this work with Paula Villa in terms of the financial crisis. Young people who joined the labour market at that moment when the financial crisis struck were subject to greater levels of insecurity. They didn't necessarily find jobs. There was a policy and economic labour market panic around how to treat the labour market as a whole, protecting those with jobs first, so those without jobs fall further down the priority list. But also those that do find jobs find worse jobs. And if you find worse jobs early in your career and early in your life course, then that follows you throughout your life. But we also found that there were people not finding jobs and finding other opportunities like training or being on some kind of scheme, but a growth of what was called at the time and still called now NEETs, not in employment, education, and training. Now that means they have no productive time, as we would say as an economist or for the labour market. But those people their scarring is much greater because there's a big gap in their CV at a very individual level. But those NEETs, as we call them, NEETs, are subject to poor well-being and subject to exclusion and social exclusion, and particularly social exclusion where they're outside household that can protect them. And work I was done with Janine Lesh and Helen Russell demonstrated how the very poor well-being outcomes for those individuals. How even in the welfare states can help in some countries, but even in countries where the welfare state is rather protective, we've found a particularly challenging experience in terms of well-being. Furthermore, work again with Paula Villa, but also with Alina Sandor and Gabriela Boloffa, we looked at the trajectories of people at those key moments. When those people who found a bad job, did they go on to find a better job afterwards? And there's an increasing share of people who sort of in turbulent trajectories that don't ever find good jobs over that period. Also, these individuals have joined the labour market just at the moment of the growth of the gig economy. And the gig economy is something that's very novel. People sell their time in small chunks to Uber or to Deliveroo, or wherever it might be. But also it's something that's actually as old as time, in that people will sell their particular labour for a day, and there's a whole body of work about day labouring in the United States around where people are able to work for a very short time and then go on and do something else. This just simply digitalises that, but it increases the risk on the individual and fragments them from wider society. So work I've been doing with Genevieve Shanahan and Paul Stewart in France, we looked at gig workers to highlight how they were sold a dream of the positive opportunities of being a gig worker, only to find the great levels of insecurity that they experience. And even though they were apparently given a choice, that choice was again constrained, but not just constrained by societal influences, this time constrained by the app itself. The app that measures their availability, measures their particular response time. Also, this notion of moments in time impacts upon policymakers as well. Work I've done with Paula Villa points to the fact that some policymakers were familiar and actually had a battery of policies to help the youth labour market at that moment in time when the financial crisis struck, whereas others didn't have that history and those institutions that support the transition from school to work. And that meant we termed it learning to swim. Those policymakers were learning to swim just at the moment you really don't want to be learning to swim, in the choppy waters of a recession and an economic and financial crisis, whereas those countries and policymakers that had strong institutions that helped young people get time on the labour market, get experience to build their careers, allowed them to ride through. So the scarring effects, the impact on unemployment, the impact on those individuals was much less. So we compared those who were learning to swim and those who were experienced and competent swimmers for the choppy waters of the financial crisis. And that moment in time we can see parallels with now in terms of the pandemic. How do we respond now to the post-pandemic labour market? But it's also possible to be in the right place at the right time. Now, much of the work I've done has been about gender equality in a European context. And that came around a little bit by chance, me being in the right place at the right time, but also the fact that there was a composition of governments, policymakers and stakeholders in the European Union in the mid-90s who came together to try to promote a more equal set of labour market policies, to integrate more groups into the labour market, and a notion of more dual earner type households rather than male breadwinner type households. Now that was a rare moment where those things came together, but it led to something called the European Employment Strategy, which was a revolutionary at the time, a pan-national set of employment regulations, so regulating employment and promoting common regulations across countries, which is very difficult for employers and for managers and particularly for governments to accept that the policy might be coming from elsewhere. But the idea that we can learn best practice and move towards a higher level, high employment type society. So those things came together in order to shape this notion of men and women working on the labour market in a more equal fashion, and the sense that the productive factor that I talked about earlier, those regulations can be a productive factor to push the labour market into a more positive dynamic. Now, that position became rather fragile over time as the governments changed, the stakeholders changed, but it remains as a legacy of policies that were of the moment and the right time and the right place, which are hard to wind back, even though there's some things that do wind back. And work I've done with Simon Deakin and Brendan Birchall, and again with Jackie O'Reilly, shows how even if we fix one thing on the labour market, then other inequalities pop up. So it's important for policymakers always to be vigilant for new things, whether it's our gig workers, or whether it's new forms of inequality, or whether it's the post-pandemic environment. There are these particular challenges. So there's an autonomy to the labour supply in terms of women and men wanting to work more, but those inequalities are hard to stamp out. You can also be at the right time in the right place at a personal level. The very first thing I remember photocopying with my name on was an article about how much people work and what would happen if we work slightly different numbers of hours across countries. And we tried to scenarioize different distributions of employment, different distributions of hours of work in different sectors, for different groups of workers, and what would be the outcome of that. Now, unfortunately, I've lost that article. I don't know where it is anymore. But I recall very vividly the sense of great pride when I saw coming off the photocopier, my name, Jill Ruby at the front, Colette Fagan and Mark Smith. Yeah, I thought, that's me. And it was that sense of pride. You still as an academic, you still feel that today when you see your name. But also being in the right time at the right place. Right now, in South Africa, we're about to do these pilots for the 4-day week, which is an exciting moment. And actually brings me back to that very first article. What happens if we all work slightly different hours? And being in the right time at the right place, that project is actually connected to some of my other co-authors from the United Kingdom and elsewhere in Europe. So it's a nice circularity to my working time research project that I find myself on now here in my newest context in South Africa, brings me back to my former co-authors such as Brendan Birchall, but also with my new colleagues like Dolis Viljoen and Angus Bowmaker and Marius Ungara as well as others. So that's a really nice sort of sense of being in the right time and the right place. But the most important thing about being in the right time and the right place was being in the right time and the right place when I fell into being an academic. I didn't want to be an academic. I actually wanted to be a rock climber. And thanks to the person in the top left, Jill Ruby, who offered me a job to manipulate spreadsheets and Excel for a few months, I fell into a career which is a great privilege and has brought me across all these different contexts and to all these different opportunities. And very few of them have been on my own, and they're all with different co-authors from many different backgrounds, many different institutions, and all of these people underpin the projects and the publications that I've been talking about today. But it's also thanks to my family, putting up with me talking and writing about family and work-life integration at deeply unsocial hours. I recall Jill Rubery saying to me when I was when one conference we went to, there's a certain irony about these academics talking about balancing work and family life on a Sunday. writing about these articles in the middle of the night because that's what we want to do. So I thank my family for indulging me when I thought this was the most important thing to do. And the keen-eyed among you will see them here on the screen, among my co-authors. But also my family were the ones who reminded me that that was not the most important thing to do. The most important thing was to spend time with them. And that's a lesson for all of us when we think about paid work and unpaid work. Thank you.
Good evening to the Professor Smith family and friends, to Professor Stan du Plessis, our Chief Operating Officer, Professor Ingrid Willard, the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Management Sciences, University leadership present, leadership of the Faculty of EMS and Stellenbosch Business School, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you this evening and a privilege to share and be part of this inaugural lecture, which is effectively the introduction of Professor Smith and his academic scholarship and interests to the academic community at Stellenbosch University, but also to the community at large in Stellenbosch and in Belleville. Now, as has been mentioned by our Dean, the inaugural lecture is typically a rite of passage event within an institution, which marks the recognition of a colleague that's been promoted or appointed and enters the ranks of full professor. In the case of Professor Smith, it is the recognition of him being bestowed the rank of full professor on joining the University of Stellenbosch, as he has mentioned, approximately 2 years ago. This event affords the opportunity to Professor Smith to share with us his innovative ideas, his discoveries, his deep insights, with regards to his discipline focus and his academic scholarship and interests. So thank you very much, Mark, for your lecture on The Times Are Changing. I have to say, this is probably one of the most unique inaugural lectures that I have attended. and that concept of time, both quantitative and qualitative, in both the work and in life, was academically interrogated in your presentation. I have to say jokingly, though, that the interrogation of time was so comprehensive in your lecture that I was almost expecting the whole theory of the space-time continuum to also be touched upon in your lecture. So you started off by emphasizing that time is really a contested terrain when it comes to the world of work, contested over the limits and regulations on work time, contested on whether workers are compensated for their flexibility or penalized as well for that flexibility associated with their work, contested on whether workers with unpaid responsibilities can balance the competing demands on their time. I have to say I quite enjoyed the continuous theme of time in your lecture, including the journey of time, through time, and the issues of time in the workplace and of our times. Gee, that's getting a bit much, but you can see I've been caught up in your theme now, right? So this intertwining of time into your presentation, even when you went into the mentioning of Bob Dylan and how his music captures a moment in time of the civil rights movement in the United States and the protests of the time just before Kennedy's assassination. The lyrics are about a constant of change, which is time, how societies, norms, and peoples change over time. And that is also something that came out very nicely in your presentation. These lyrics render the song's timeless sense that they capture the onwards march of time, but also the tensions and the different perspectives between generations and peoples that are as relevant today as they were in the 1960s. Now, in your journey of time, you presented on time, time in context, norms around time, organization of time, expatriations in time, regulation of time, the very aptly wrong place at the wrong time. I'm not going to say why, but I think you know why. The right place at the right time, the future of time, and the time with colleagues. All the way through weaving your experiences with colleagues and your gained experiences and work on time. Now, one of the indicators of a good inaugural lecture is the ability of the professor to share deep and complex disciplinary knowledge in a manner that is both understandable but also thought-provoking. And I think you can't deny that tonight's lecture was thought-provoking. It's the first time I've actually thought about time in this way. And it's about being able to do that to a general audience, but also articulate the novelty and the complexity of your work to disciplinary experts. And this is an incredible balancing act. Okay, as Mark also says, integration, right? Yeah. Not balancing, integration. And you have done this impeccably well tonight. So your lecture tonight gives us a timeless new reflection, at least for me, on time and the relativistic thinking, approach, and understanding of time and its influence on all aspects of our lives, both in the workplace and in our private lives, as well as the integration of time. You brought into perspective that time is not the same for all of us. That's that whole issue of relativistic thinking. The work on working time regimes underlines how the treatment of paid and unpaid work in different contexts is a source of the inequalities women and men face in the labor market. And you even quoted that work time regimes are highly dependent on the cultural, the institutional, and the regulatory environments of the society. I'm Celia. And on time, finally, Professor Smith, I want to congratulate you on your body of research and work on the study of time and the complexity thereof in understanding this concept from multiple perspectives. I'm sure that time will tell whether your academic scholarship into the concept of time would lead to even more timely hypotheses and analysis of the effects and impact of time on our times. Thank you very much, and congratulations.
The Deputy Vice Chancellor for Learning and Teaching, Professor Daresh Ram Jagannath. Did I get it right? Excellent. The Chief Operating Officer, Professor Stan Duplessis. The Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, Professor Ingrid Woolard. The leadership of the Business School, Professor Mark Smith's family, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Graham, Michael Graham, and my work is quite easy. I'm privileged to be asked to give this vote of thanks. Professor Ram Jagannath has said it all, so I'll be very brief. Now, I will say many thanks to Mr. and Mrs. Smith for being here. And I hope that you get the opportunity to remind him of the days that he held onto your feet, not wanting to go to school. Look at you now, a professor. I'd also like to thank all of you present here with us today, making this event worthwhile and beautiful. Thank you, one. Thank you all. Like I said, I'll be brief. Now is my favorite time of this auspicious occasion. It's a second to the refreshment. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening.